Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Welcome to the Hidden Corners. Tonight we're bringing you two short stories centered around flowers. Our first story is called The Queen of the Night by Ginger Winters. The night breeze brought the smell of flowers. For a moment he forgot the smothering oppression of the heat that had threatened to kill him earlier in the day. His eyes were closed as he lifted his head and breathed in that heady fragrance, attempting to let his senses guide him in the direction of the smell. He had spent his entire adult life searching for the rarest species on the planet, but this was the rarest of them all. His teeth caught savagely at his lower lip, gnawing at it until the blood came. His hands, the fingers spread wide, the veins purple and standing out, moved slowly and tensely to his throat. He needed water. The dizziness was coming back as it had earlier in the day. With a tremendous, forced effort, he opened his eyes. He saw the night sky, the full moon just beginning to peek over the giant sand dunes off in the distance. How far had he walked that day? He didn't know. How stupid he was to not bring enough water. He knew better, but he hadn't realized that his canteen had grown worn and thin over the years and had developed a crack near the seam. The water had seeped out slowly until he noticed his backpack was wet. He had thought it was just sweat and ignored it until he had stopped and allowed himself a small drink of water. He was accustomed to limiting himself to one small drink every couple of hours, just to be conservative with the precious commodity, but he had gotten lost in his thoughts and let a few hours go by. By the time he'd stopped, he had lost most of the water in his canteen. The heat had made visions dance across the sands, illusions of oases, palm trees, and water. He knew it was simply a mirage due to the bending of light rays as they passed through the layers of the hot air near the ground, creating an optical illusion of water and vegetation. The parched landscape was dry, cracked, and the wind whipped up the loose sand and stung his eyes. He had fallen and didn't have the strength to pick himself up. He slept, and he dreamed. He dreamed it was in a large garden, the same garden he always saw in his dreams, with the same sweeping reach of flowers, flowers as far as he could see. Gigantic blossoming clumps of rhododendron, slender, fragile lilies of the valley, showing white and faint on the deep green leaves. Violets somewhere. He got the sickeningly sweet scent of them. Early roses growing riotously. He detested the perfume of roses. Giant calla lilies, as large as his head, beckoned to him, mocking him. Overhead, the darkening sky that held the coming moon. And all through the garden, the first dull blue shadows of evening, shadows that blurred around the shapes of flowers, shadows that spread over the flowers, smearing out the spotting color of them until they were a gloom-splotched, ghostly mass. Shadows that brought out in all its pungent power the assailing, suffocating smell. In his dream, he stood there waiting for the one thing he had spent his life searching for, the one thing he obsessed for and had to possess. In his early years as a botanist, he had been driven by an unrelenting obsession to uncover the world's most elusive and rarest blooms. He had traveled countless miles on expeditions into remote jungles and pristine mountainsides, but this one rare bloom brought him here, to this arid, desolate landscape, in search of what would be his life's greatest achievement. He woke, drifting in and out of consciousness. He could feel his heartbeat throbbing in his temples. His breath came in long, racking gasps across his dry, parched throat. His one thought was to breathe regularly. 1, 2. He tried to think of something other than his breathing. The intangible odor of the flowers choked him with their stealthy cunning. His strangling intaking of breath. 1, 2. He made himself rise from the ground. He didn't know how long he had lain there in the hot sun. Hours? Days? He had sand in his hair, in his face, in his mouth. But it was cooler now that the sun had gone down and the moon was rising. And that scent, her scent, it wafted on the breeze and led him like a dog to his food bowl. He lifted his head and breathed in the scent. It was intoxicating. 1 step, 2 steps. He forced his body to move forward toward the scent that guided him, but the dizziness made him falter. He heard a buzzing in his ears. No, it was in his head. Had he walked only a step or 2? It felt like miles. The moon shone brighter now. He could see its reflection on the sand, and he thought he could see a slight indentation in the sand, as if a trail led straight to him, as if he had fallen and slept on a thin trail in the soft sand. He wondered if he was hallucinating, but at the same time came the stark realization that it was a trail that led straight to where he had fallen, straight to him, over him, and past him. A trail made in the sand by a sidewinder. The dizziness was getting stronger. He had to find water. His leg wasn't working the way it should. It seemed to be swollen, and it throbbed with pain. He reached down and undid his belt, lowered his pants, and even in the darkness of the night he could see his skin turning purple where the snake had sunk her fangs. He thought perhaps he should tie a tourniquet around his leg, stop the traveling of the venom up his leg. Hadn't he seen that in a movie once? He pulled his bandana from his pack and tied it tightly. Nausea and dizziness descended on him. He felt he was suffocating. His vision blurred. He took a few more steps and fell. 100 yards away, a flower bloomed. Its aroma wafted through the breeze and enwrapped the man as he lay dying in its intoxicating scent. If ever there was an enchanted flower with a mystical allure, it's the night-blooming Sirius, Epiphyllum oxypetulum. People from all over the world will gather in remote desert locales to celebrate its 1 night a year appearance. Adding to the seduction is its magnetic aroma, which it emits from beautiful trumpet-shaped, waxy white flowers, the scent of which is known to be the most favored of all species of flowers. The bloom, nicknamed the Queen of the Night, will arrive sometime between sunset and midnight on a summer night, usually on or close to a full moon. Over the course of just 1 to 2 hours, the petals unfold and a thick perfume resembling magnolia or gardenia permeates the air to further intoxicate anyone fortunate enough to witness this rarity. The night-blooming Sirius is a species of cactus flower and is one of the rarest plants to live in the desert. Adding to its mystique is its inconspicuous location, desert flats and washes between 3,000 and 5,000 feet above sea level, and that it is rarely seen in the wild and very difficult to grow domestically. Although magic might seem at play for this exquisite flower, rainfall, temperature, and humidity, as well as the lunar cycle, are key to its blooming. Story number 2, Flowers for the Dead. We always had fresh flowers on the table at Grandma's house. That's because Grandma lived right in the back of the cemetery. "Nothing like flowers to brighten up a room," Grandma would say. "Eddie, you be a good boy and take a run over and fetch me some pretty ones. There was a funeral over there yesterday. Bet there's some real pretty ones. But no lilies. I don't like those smelly lilies. See if you can find me some roses." So I would scamper off, climbing the fence in the backyard and jumping down over the old graves with their leaning headstones. I'd race down the path, taking shortcuts through bushes and behind statues. I knew every inch of the cemetery long before I was 7. I learnt it from playing hide-and-seek there with my friends after dark. I liked living at the cemetery. It was better than having a big backyard, better than the rickety old house where Grandma and me lived, and by the time I was 3 or 4, I got to play out there in the graveyard every day. There were big trees and bushes everywhere, lots of nice green grass, and paths that wound off into a maze of endless mounds and all kinds of stones that were painted white. Birds were forever singing or darting all around the flowers. It was pretty there and quiet, and there was nobody to watch or bother or scold, as long as I remembered to stay out of the way of old Sourpuss, the caretaker. But old Sourpuss lived in another house, a big stone one, over on the other end of the big cemetery entrance. Grandma told me all about old Sourpuss. "He doesn't like little boys playing in there," she said, "especially when there's a funeral going on. Way he acts, you'd think he owned the place. So you go ahead and play there all you want, Eddie, only don't let him see you. After all, a boy's only young once." Grandma was swell, just plain swell. She even let me stay up late at night and play hide-and-seek with Susie and Joe behind the headstones any time I wanted. Of course, she didn't really care, because night was when Grandma had her company over. Almost nobody came to see Grandma in the daytime anymore. There was just the grocery delivery boy and sometimes the mailman. Usually he just came about once a month with Grandma's pension check. Most days there was nobody in the house except Grandma and me. Grandma would tell me what to order, and I'd make a phone call, and the next day the grocery delivery boy would drop it off on our step. Grandma always told me how much money to put in the envelope, and when she got her check once a month, well, I'd run it over to the bank and cash it for her. On those days, she would tell me to stop by the ice cream shop and get myself a double-decker ice cream cone. I always looked forward to that banking day once a month. But at night, Grandma had company. They never came before supper, but along about 8 o'clock, when it got dark, they started drifting in. Sometimes a whole bunch, sometimes just 1 or 2. Most always, Mr. Willis was there, and sometimes Sam Gates, and sometimes Mrs. Cassidy would show up. There were others, but I don't remember them all. Mr. Willis was a funny man. He was always grumbling and complaining about the cold and quarreling with Grandma about his property. "You have no idea how cold it gets," he would say, sitting over in the corner and rubbing his hands by the fire. "Day after day it just gets colder and colder. Not that I'm complaining too much, mind you. It's nothing as bad as the rheumatism I used to have." He had a long, pale old man's face that seemed to be all wrinkles and scowl. I never really got a good look at him, because right after dinner, Grandma would turn out all the lights and just keep the fire going, and I'd either go off to bed or go play outside with Susie and Joe. Mrs. Cassidy always wore a lovely black dress, always the same one, and she was all powdered and rouged and painted up. She talked to Grandma a lot about something called perpetual care. "I'll always be grateful for one thing," I'd hear her say time and time again, "and that's my perpetual care. The flowers are so pretty, I picked out the design for the blanket myself, and they keep the ground so nice, even in the winter. They certainly spare no expense, let me tell you, and I'm mighty grateful, mighty grateful." Sam Gates was the only one who paid much attention to me. He loved to tell stories about the war, and he'd sit me down close to him and tell me stories all night if he could. Grandma would get mad at him and tell him he was putting big ideas in the head of a 6-year-old, and I didn't need to know no war stories. But the best times of all were spent with Susie and Joe. I can't remember the first time I played with them, or where they lived, or who their parents were, or why they came only at night to play, calling under the kitchen window, "Oh, Eddie, come on out and play." Joe was black-haired and kind of quiet. Susie was my age, or maybe a little younger. She had curly, taffy-colored hair and always wore a ruffled dress, which she was careful not to stain or dirty, no matter how many times we took a tumble in the grass. I had a big crush on her. We'd play hide-and-seek all over the graveyard, night after night. It didn't matter how long we stayed up playing. No one ever came calling after them, and my grandma didn't mind. She didn't care how late we stayed out playing either. Then one day, trouble came in the form of a big black car and a man in a blue suit. He came to the door and asked to talk to my parents. He wanted to know why I wasn't in school. I told him I didn't have any parents, that I lived here with my grandma. He wanted to talk to her, but she didn't want to talk to him, I guess, 'cause I couldn't find her anywhere. I looked and looked, and she was hiding. She didn't like talking to people, except her friends that came at night. He came back the next day, and the next. On the third day there was a really pretty woman with him. She smelled like strawberries. She told me I had to come with her. That didn't feel right, not one bit, but Grandma wouldn't come out to talk to her either. She just sat up in her room and cried and cried. They took me away from Grandma's house that day. They took me on a train to a place called an orphanage. That was the end. There were no fresh flowers every day at the orphanage, and none of the kids were like Susie and Joe, and I had all kinds of rules to follow, and a bedtime. Everyone was pretty nice, though, considering. Mrs. Ward, the matron, told me she wanted me to think of her as my mother, that being the least she could do considering my harrowing experience with losing my whole family and all that. I didn't know what she meant by that. I know my parents aren't around anymore, but my grandmother is right there at the house, probably feeling pretty sad that I'm not there. Everyone told me it was best I didn't remember my time living at my grandma's, but how could I ever forget? They even tried to tell me that my grandma had died in the same accident that took my parents away. Imagine how crazy that sounds. It's just 'cause Grandma don't like talking to people that she don't know, but Grandma took care of me since I was 2 years old in that old house of hers. Grandma never did write to me, and I was pretty sore about that. I didn't figure she'd forgotten me, but she really should have sent me a letter, let me know she was okay and all that. After many years, I was old enough to graduate from the orphanage and went straight into the military, shipped overseas before I hardly knew what was happening. I could have sworn I saw Sam Gates standing there beside me in the trenches when the shrapnel from the shell fire tore through my body. It was a good thing, though, 'cause they gave me a little time off, and the first thing I did was take the train out to Grandma's house. I was trembling when I got in front of the old house. on the edge of the cemetery. It was older, more rickety than I remembered. I didn't see anyone around. The house was empty, so I wandered over to the cemetery and found some nice flowers to bring to Grandma. Soon as I walked in the door with those flowers, well, she was right there, just like she'd been waiting for me. Grandma was still Grandma. She stood there in the doorway, and she was little and wrinkled and beautiful. I handed her the flowers, and she told me to come on into the parlor, that they were all there waiting for me. And sure enough, there was Mr. Willis and Mrs. Cassidy and Sam Gates, and they were sitting there just like they always were. Mr. Willis was complaining about the cold, and Mrs. Cassidy was talking about her perpetual care. Grandma was putting her roses in a vase, and outside the moon was peeking through the curtains, and I heard Susie and Joe calling out to me, "Eddie, come out and play."